Welcome to the Agents Angle, providing a window into the world of the football agents. You know, those creatures who some would have you believe only spring into life during a transfer window. With me, Jonathan Booker.
And me, Peter Paleologus. This week on the Agents Angle, we look ahead to the forthcoming transfer window and what can possibly be expected this time around. And our special guest today is a record breaker in the agents world who had a starring role in the last set of transfer windows.
Also, we have news from FIFA and the somewhat secretive FIFA Agent Working Group, whereby, although agent matters are discussed, it rarely seems the vast majority of those in the football agents world receive any updates.
All that to come on this episode of the Agents Angle.
So as many players, managers and coaches sun themselves on beaches around the world, well, at least those who are not competing at the Euros in Germany, we still await our break from proceedings. But of course, there are several things to talk about, as the sun is almost about to rise and shine through many of the main transfer windows around the world.
Yes, the European and North American summers, a chance for some in the industry to reset and take a break. However, as you mentioned, Jonathan, the Euros, Copa America on, a lot of players being scouted, got new coaches, ambitious clubs. So there's no break for the agents industry. It's full throttle from here.
And with that, there has actually been a very rare sighting in the football agents world in just the last week or so. And that is the sighting of the lesser spotted and even lesser reported FIFA AWG. Agent Working Group. Not at its supposed home of Zurich in Switzerland or Saudi Arabia, but this time via video link, as we understand. And as it is very unlikely that FIFA will release a detailed report or minutes of the latest AWG meeting, as they haven't with the previous two AWGs, we thought we would relay some of the information we are hearing from this third meeting of the AWG.
Yes, we approached and canvassed several sources about the FIFA Agent Working Group meeting earlier this month. And there were several talking points and several agenda items. So right now, I think this will interest a lot of listeners and agents generally. There are 7,400 plus licensed FIFA agents worldwide. And to break that down, most are from the exam, but about 1,800 were legacy agents. Interestingly, there was a mention of investigations, and 5 or 6 investigations by FIFA or the FIFA Agents Department were about persons performing football services without a license in several key markets, England, Belgium and USA, but also Indonesia. We've known this has been a scourge of the agent industry when unlicensed people perform football agent services. Now, the exam itself, again, similar pattern to the first and the second. The major countries that had the most examinees, top 5 was England, Belgium, Spain, the United States of America, and Brazil. 159 member associations organised exam sessions. And it's good to see more national federations host exams, especially in countries where maybe before they didn't have the facilities or the organisation. I'm sure FIFA's supporting that. Now, something that everyone's interested in, the pass rates. The third exam pass rate, 41%, compared to 52% from the first exam and the very low or dismal 19% from the second. There also a mention of continuous professional development, CPD as we know it. The most completed course of the CPD is the registration of players. Now, the authorization that most agents want to pass is the minors authorization. 2,740 agents have completed that authorization, which pretty much is a third as well. Just to wrap up the summary, the feedback that we got from several sources, we believe that memorandums of understanding have been offered by FIFA to various agent associations who have members on the FIFA Agent Working Group. Now, how is this going to work? Is there funding involved? Are there reciprocal agreements? Will all the agent associations get the same agreements and same terms? We don't know any of that. All we know, there's been an offering of an MOU between FIFA and the Agent Association. We don't know if it recognises stakeholder status either, so that's quite interesting. Now, the last point we mentioned earlier in the previous episodes, the FIFA Agent Department, a very important department in FIFA now. You're talking about having 7,000 plus agents out there. They have 4 staff, and from what we can see, several are new.
In all honesty, Peter, despite there being some interesting statistics, and I always have to stress these are FIFA statistics, so taken with a considerable pinch of salt, I think various people, including myself, will have reservations, if not concerns, regarding what has emerged from this most recent AWG meeting. Although we may not have all the information from the meeting, and also some of the other things we are being discreet about due to such things as unanswered questions or a lack of detail, and as such, we aren't going to raise those in this show. Well, not for now, anyway. But for me, the pass rate is still too high, possibly 4 times what it was pre 2015. And there is talk that the third exam was perceived as easier by some candidates. We don't want a barrier to entry. Some people do. We know that. We just want a relevant, fair, and measure of practical competency for agents who are licensed. Then on to the number of licensed agents in total. Something again I'm not surprised by, and I have heard the attitude in football authority circles, including FIFA, that they don't expect many of those to re-register after 1 or 2 years in the industry. The seemingly low proportion of agents with FIFA authorization to represent minors is also interesting. However, I think that proportion will grow over the coming months, if only due to the limited amount of FIFA CPD available to agents currently on the portal. And thus, to obtain the required number of CPD credits, agents will have to complete the minors module, which still reportedly has some errors in it. But it needs to be stressed that in some jurisdictions, you need the domestic FA's authorization or that of another regulatory body to represent minors. And FIFA's authority on that aspect is not necessarily applicable in all cases. Suspension and termination statistics, we don't know whether these are matters instigated by FIFA or national associations or both, and the number of suspensions and terminations seemingly accounts for less than 1% of licensed agents at the moment. And on those investigation statistics, it was only reportedly covering the period of the exam window. So I would ask, why is that? Which exam window are they referring to? Are FIFA only investigating on exam and registration related matters? Or even is FIFA, by focusing those statistics for a limited period, looking to skew or inflate FIFA's actual activity on such investigatory matters? As you mentioned, there was also news of new recruits in FIFA's agent department, which is welcome following many departures in recent times. So FIFA's agents department now has an overwhelming 4 members of staff. So welcome to those people. Maybe a time to celebrate a little. We now have 4 people to support currently, by FIFA stats, 7,440 licensed agents, a ratio of 1 to every 1,860. And one final thing, Peter, that I think we should highlight. From these statistics by FIFA on licensed agent numbers, by my reckoning, agent registration fees thus far will be just short of 4.5 million US dollars going to FIFA. And it certainly doesn't seem to have been invested yet in CPD or fixing the agent's platform. Yes, the agent's register is still down at the time of recording.
Interestingly, you mentioned the figure of 4.5, close to $5 million fees. I know that one thing that came out of FAWG is the fee to come down from 600 to 300. I think one of the agent associations was pushing that. It could have been Africa. That was previously because of the costs, especially some agents aren't earning that much. But on your point about the platform and the agents directory, there are still some problems with the platform, and sometimes it doesn't show even how much CPD points you have completed, depending on whether you're a legacy agent or examinee agent, because there's different CPD requirements for both. And also the agent directory, which I think right now, a lot of players, a lot of clubs, yes, they can ask for the license number, etc., but want to check a directory to see who has the license so they can do their due diligence. Overall, it seems that there's a lot to discuss. Hopefully, we'll see more outcomes. It's only been the 3rd meeting, but I would like to see more communication. And I would like to see people reach out to the wider agent audience as well to really facilitate a better agent landscape. Jonathan.
There were other things apparently discussed at this latest AWG meeting, such as changes to the exam and the registration period, plus new questions for the exam from possibly members of the AWG. There was also a mention of a parental playbook, a survey for the football associations nationally regarding first pro contracts. And the possibility of the exam being held online, which I am guessing means anyone could sit the exam at home. So at best from all of this, a selection of things for me that FIFA were already stating as objectives some 2 or more years ago, or things that don't necessarily directly relate to agents. And a very worrying notion of an online remote exam, dare I say, more devaluing of the licensing process. What next? Some may be asking. Give away the agent license on the back of boxes of breakfast cereal. But above all, and something we touched on in the last episode, and you've mentioned it, is this mention of an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, between FIFA and members of the AWG. And this is something I'm very concerned about, given the way things have panned out over the last couple of years. Firstly, there's only 4 agent organisations represented at the AWG, as we understand it. 2 of which are regional or continental, not global. And one of the others, I don't believe, is officially participating at the AWG, but we won't try and explain the politics and history behind that. So what proportion of what FIFA state are nearly 7,500 licensed agents do these organisations and individuals actually represent in possibly signing a memorandum of understanding with FIFA? 2, we don't know the basis of the MOU. At the crudest of levels, what the agent organisations are receiving from FIFA for signing up to the MOU and what they are promising to FIFA in return, or whether those they supposedly represent have approved the MOU and by what majority. And 3, if some members of the AWG refuse to sign the MOU, will it jeopardise their AWG place and result in FIFA replacing them with someone who will sign up to it? One there for us to keep an eye on, I think. As you know, Peter, I have reservations about the AWG. I won't go quite as far as some in calling it a total charade, as we know some of the people on the AWG are good people with positive intentions for the agents and the industry. But this AWG is again reaffirming a long-held fear for me that at best it's an afterthought for FIFA, or that it is actually seen as a tool by FIFA in trying to legitimise FFAR and FIFA's engagement with agents. I've said it before, for some time in fact, and I maintain that something like the AWG is needed to both address agent-related issues and provide a voice for agents, but it needs to be created and structured properly, be a recognised stakeholder group, and be representative of agents and not FIFA-controlled. Because at the moment, the legitimacy of the AWG is severely in doubt, dare I say, even beginning to be questioned by some people on the AWG itself.
The FIFA Agents Working Group has very good people, bright, passionate about agent interests and lobbying on behalf of agents. But I would say, Jonathan, a little bit hamstrung because we know there's certain provisions in terms of the cap, in terms of even the Agents Tribunal is not functioning at the moment, from what we hear. And certain other provisions in terms of the FFAR. So it's quite difficult. It's quite a delicate balance. One thing, though, we have not heard about is some of the other stakeholders on the FAWG. What are FIFPro saying? What are ECA saying? European Club Association, FIFPro being the International Players Union. What are they saying at the FAWG? Have not seen any correspondence, communications, media releases, or anything from any of those stakeholders. And that will be an interesting viewpoint because they do have a seat at the table of what they're putting forward in terms of the agent space and the industry. So I think we need to watch that space. Now I want to go back, or go forward, I should say, to the upcoming window. And right now, it's the appropriate time to go through an article that we found. The article's entitled The Summer Transfer Window, 11 Global Trends Insiders Believe Will Shape the Market, a New York Times article by Adam Leventhal. And it's basically an article that came out of interviews that were taken in the Rome Summit of Transfer Room. But I'll go through the key ones. The English Premier League. The mention here, or through the interviews, is the trend that the English Premier League clubs will keep spending, but are scared of breaching profit and sustainability rules. They're going to be much more cautious. PSR, they call it. There was an interview, anonymous, saying everyone is scared of PSR, and that's going to affect the transfer market. Germany. The mention is Kane to Germany. We know that was a big transfer. Will be the exception, not the rule. They just don't have the money to compete. And also comparing wages to England is an issue. Maybe some of the clubs like Bayern Munich can probably compete, maybe Dortmund, but it's also the way the majority shareholding in Germany works with 50+1 makes it very difficult. Italy, we mentioned in a previous podcast that their tax change could be a disruptor. The Decreto Crescita, the growth decree, which allowed players or coaches, especially in the Serie A who haven't worked in Italy for the previous 2 years, to only pay 50% of their earnings. That was going to be scrapped. They're fighting to keep it, but with less lucrative TV right deals and without that tax exemption, the Italian market could be a good market, but could be disrupted by that tax change. In Brazil, there's been a lot of recent investment by several groups buying clubs, so influx of capital there. And that sort of translates to transfer deals. We're seeing bigger salaries of 800,000 to 1.1 million net pounds, something you wouldn't have imagined a few years ago. So of salaries to keep good players, but also they are an export market. I'll go through a few other trends. The upcoming World Cup, we know it's in Mexico, USA and Canada. And there's a mention of that World Cup really igniting. We know Mexico football's huge, but the USA and Canada market, audience-wise, interest-wise, club-wise, transfer-wise, all that to be generated from that World Cup. But the other trend is interesting that in the US, we've obviously seen a lot of experienced European and South American players join MLS, but now there's more of a trend of younger players because of two reasons. We know there's a salary cap in the MLS. And secondly, a lot of them are getting developed and going to Europe. So they're seeing a market of talented young players. I'll mention Africa. We saw the AFCON, a lot of great players, a lot of scouts going in that. And also the Club World Cup 2025 will be seen as a trend going forward because we'll have more African clubs showcasing their talent. One of them is Mamelodi Sundowns from South Africa, who say they've got a lot of talent. They need an opportunity to showcase. Just some smaller markets to finish off. Turkey. We know Turkey's got the three big clubs. They bought some big players the last few years, like Dzeko, Icardi. But now the shift is for younger homegrown talent. So younger players to be able to sell to the bigger markets. Poland. I had a look at some data from the CIS and Trademark. They're one of the oldest average ages in their league, the Ekstraklasa. And teams don't give enough time to under 21 players. Well, there's some incentives from the league. They want to drop the average and promote youth development. So that's an opportunity for agents who've got good players who are maybe not ready for the bigger markets. Poland's a good entry point. Lastly, League One, the French. Take away PSG, which I'd say anomaly, but a powerhouse themselves. The French clubs have to be creative with recruitment, and that's the key. And I'm going to quote this from one of the French interviewees from this Transfer Room Summit. Our priority is to find an interesting player, not famous, give them an opportunity, then sell. They're the trends. I found this article very interesting because it's a signpost, Jonathan. Agents need to be across the trends. And this article, although it's coming out of the Transfer Room, really highlights a good variety of trends, Jonathan.
Now, I don't really want to get into the practice of predicting trends as this industry is unpredictable enough as it is. However, the first thing from this article that I wanted to reference is that Transfer Room Summit reportedly had 300 clubs in attendance, which on the face of it is impressive and probably exceeds some previous Y-Scout forums even. However, one, we don't know who the clubs were, such as geographic location and level of football, and two, we don't know the representatives that the clubs sent. And the reason why I raise that is that we've both been to similar events in the past, not Transfer Room for me at least. And while some clubs do send key decision makers on transfers and recruitment to such events, a lot don't. And some clubs have even been known to send preferred agents to represent the club, which can promote an unhealthy conflict of interest. But just looking at some of the countries mentioned in the article, firstly Germany, there is of course a twist from the agent's angle here in that we still, at the moment, have that link to Germany. So currently no FFAR or agent regulations as such, and thus agents may be able to work more creatively with German clubs and players. Italy has those several matters up in the air at the moment, such as the agent regulations and the growth decree. So possibly a few exits of non-Italian players from Italy in this window, and then maybe a reversal in future windows when things become a bit clearer in terms of agent regulations and football tax issues. Then Brazil, which is always going to play a key role in any transfer window because of the conveyor belt of talent that they produce. But as you rightly say, Brazilian talent isn't going to be as cheap as it was. However, there is an interesting agent-related factor with Brazil, and that's the increasing number of collaborations and mergers between Brazilian agencies and agencies in the US and Europe. But for me, there were a couple of disappointing omissions in the article, and again, no criticism of Adam, who wrote the article. Firstly, there's no mention of Portugal, arguably a primary doorway to much of South America in football transfer terms. Greece, who of course had a club-winning UEFA honours last season. And astoundingly, little mention of Africa, probably one of the biggest pools of football talent.
There are gaps in what has been presented. I suppose you can't write about everything, but what agents need to do, though, is be on top of those. And each market is different, but then it's also a microcosm. Each club is different. Each club's got a different philosophy. Each club has got a different coach. So I see where you come sometimes from, Jonathan, that trends can be misleading because it can be very different from club to club and what type of players, what type of style, philosophy they're going to have. So we can't generalize, but I do like this article because it does give some insights in the broader context of what's happening in the market and what trends clubs, players, and more importantly for us, agents are going to see, Jonathan.
But to an extent, the elephant in the room is, of course, England. And there used to be the phrase that when America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. Well, over recent years, I think it's safe to say that in football terms, that could be true of English football, and in particular the Premier League, because big transfers there can cause a domino effect elsewhere and provide for fluidity in the football transfer market. However, as we've spoken about in recent episodes of the Agents Angle, there are big threats to the financial firepower that English Premier League clubs have been able to wield in the past, which all impacts on the agents industry. Firstly, there's the independent football regulator, which is very much on the cards for the UK in the future. Then, more notably, last season saw some Premier League clubs receive point deductions for breaches of PSR, profit and sustainability regulations, and cost control rules. And some of those clubs only just escaped relegation because of it. And it isn't over in that respect because there are reports of more clubs being investigated and possibly receiving points deductions this coming season as well. And on that specific matter, the article does mention one unnamed Premier League club source stating that clubs are scared of PSR. And for me, I think that's overplaying it just a bit. Yes, the smaller clubs may be scared as a points deduction could risk relegation, but are the bigger clubs really scared? Concerned, yes, but they have big hitting accountants and lawyers on speed dial, so as they not necessarily need to be scared of PSR. So English clubs are going to have to be more diligent and thoughtful in their recruitment strategy and spending, which will have a knock-on effect for many, including agents.
In terms of the agent business, we're all susceptible to these trends. And there's one trend that's also changed our remit or landscape, the power of the sporting director. We're seeing a lot more power in the hands of the sporting director and the way they see the philosophy and blueprint for the club. And in our relationship with clubs, the sporting director, not just the coach or the president, is key. And it's growing in England, it's growing in a lot of countries. And then it's our own space. Agencies are being bought out. Agencies are merging. There's a lot of play in our space that we have to deal with, besides what's happening on the player, club, sustainability or anchoring. And we talk about all these rules that may affect agent fees. There's a lot going on, Jonathan.
But as far as possible changes to the industry, rather than just trends, there is also something else to consider as a possibility here, Peter. And this is something I have actually spoken about for a few years. And that is the notion of player swaps, or to use the American term, trades. As player trades are pretty standard practice and accepted in the big American sports as part of the recruitment strategy. Arguably, this could be a minefield for football and very complex for the industry to adapt to, including agents, not least to get all parties to agree to such a trade, as salaries, personal terms and bonuses will vary. And then you have the egos to consider as well. However, I think we have already seen quite a few trade or swap arrangements creep into football, albeit informal arrangements between clubs. But there are other issues to consider that complicate the notion of trades becoming more prevalent in football in the future, not least that from an agent's perspective, because even if it's a straightforward trade, there is a question mark over any transfer fee, which I can definitely see some agents shuddering at the thought of, because many agents now, especially some of the bigger names, do more brokering of deals than anything else, with a keen focus on the actual transfer fee for generating their commission. But swaps and trades of a sort are becoming more evident. And this could be more to do with the clubs working together to keep within those cost control related regulations, such as PSR in the EPL, as we discussed. Plus, on top of that, another complication we have to consider is that multi-club ownership aspect, which, as well as skewing the financial aspects, also brings into question the integrity of competition if there's a swap or trade of players going on. So, as ever, it's a hugely complicated, difficult yet intriguing transfer landscape now, not just for clubs and players, but especially agents, and something everyone will have to continue to adapt to in the future.
Yeah, you mentioned a very interesting matter in trading players. Having clubs operate their transfers in a direct player for player trade format instead of shelling out huge transfer fees would certainly make interesting bouts for negotiations by agents, especially. That's a whole new terrain, but it's a trend and it's starting happening with younger players, and we may see more of that. As you say, Jonathan, an American influence, but a lot of American influences are creeping into the game. It's an international business. And now it's time to introduce our guest. It's Christopher Atkins, licensed FIFA football agent from the agency TMJ, the marketing jersey, based in Dallas, the United States of America, but maintains a presence all around the football world. Christopher has a major in Chinese studies. He was a freelance sports journalist based in China, Hong Kong, and also with ESPN. Christopher also worked as a football intermediary with the well-known English football agency, World in Motion. Chris's name will be known to many as the representative agent of Zambian international Racheal Kundananji, and he was also instrumental in Racheal's world record-breaking move from Madrid CFF to Bay FC earlier this year in February 2024. Christopher, I'll refer to you as Chris. Welcome to the Agents Angle.
Thank you very, very much for having me, Peter.
Thank you. For those newly licensed agents who may be thinking they're going to smash transfer records, there is a large slice of luck involved and usually an incredible amount of hard work as well. It certainly doesn't happen overnight from all our experiences. So to get to the point of a record-breaking deal, Chris, can you just give us and our listeners a brief timeline from the point of how you became an agent and your pathway to where you are now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think to start off, if you're going to get to the point of large deals, then not even necessarily record breaking, the most important aspect of that is to have the right client, the right player on your books. If you have that, then obviously the kind of deals you're talking about come your way. So I started basically by helping a few agents get contacts and approach clubs in China. That would have been in roughly 2013. And then I started doing it as a full-time job the following year, 2014, because I could see some of the opportunities there. And that was more on the men's side at that point. However, my first client was a China Women's International called Wang Shuang, who later went on to play for PSG and is currently at Tottenham. So that was kind of my initial foray. I spent a few years working on the men's side of things. Wasn't overly successful, but was doing enough to kind of get by, keep myself in business. And then in 2018, opportunities started emerging in the women's league in China. And I found more opportunities on that side of things, initially brokering other people's clients, as I didn't have too many myself other than a couple of Chinese girls. And then as time went on, I built a client base out of the demands of that market in kind of 2019, 2020. Then obviously COVID hit and moved back to the UK with my family. And I've turned much more onto a global focus than perhaps I was back then. But yeah, that's a little bit of a timeline. And then in terms of the deal you mentioned, Racheal Kundananji, I signed her as a client in December 2018 off the back of the Africa Cup of Nations. She had a kind of breakthrough tournament at 18 years old. And yeah, it's been a 5-year path from there that's taken her through Champions League qualifiers with Beat Kazika in Kazakhstan. She did 2.5 years there. And then Eibar in Spain, on to Madrid CFF, and then this year to NWSL with Bay FC. So it's been a long journey together, but a fruitful one.
And there you go. There's a note for all those agents who have just recently passed the exam. It doesn't come overnight, and a lot of air miles, a lot of road miles, and a lot of hard work goes into it. But with regards to that move, and it was a record-breaking deal for Racheal to Bay FC, but you could eclipse that in the future with a future transfer, of course, whether it be with Racheal or another client. But in particular, with regards to that deal, can you give an insight as to how it developed? How long did it take? The biggest challenges that you faced as an agent? And also what surprised you, if anything, with that transfer?
Yeah, so I think you could probably say the timeline on that particular deal was about 12 months, because 12 months previously, Racing Louisville, another team in NWSL, had tried to sign Racheal. At that point, she didn't feel it was the right move, and she actually renewed her contract at that point with Madrid CFF. But the connection there is Racing Louisville's head of recruitment at that time then went on to the similar role in AFC. So once he was there in the second half of the year, he obviously led in terms of coming back to us to see what Racheal's situation was. Now, Racheal had renewed her contract, as I said. She still had a couple of years left on it, but she had a release clause in that contract, which was on the large side. It was 700,000 euros, so fairly large for women's football. And that's the point we got to. The Madrid were fairly clear that if she was to leave, it was going to involve paying that clause. That then brings complexities in terms of how you actually trigger the clause. It's not been done in women's football with a transfer at that size, so we obviously had to engage lawyers or simply get some advice off the league in Spain as to the process involved. And the lawyers obviously then advised on the tax implications of that process. In the end, that was always plan B because of the complication, and we managed to eventually structure a deal in excess of the clause that allowed both Madrid and AFC to get what they wanted. The players' negotiation was a much simpler process, but yeah, it involved going beyond the clause, which I believe is quite common, to simply make the process a far more smooth and amicable one.
Now, the world of women's football, both on and off the pitch, is developing at an absolutely astonishing rate. And there is a likelihood, because of that rate, that the record set by Racheal and Bay, and of course your invaluable work in the background, it could be broken this summer. And at the time of recording this interview, we're awaiting the reopening of many of the major women's football transfer windows in the next month or so. For instance, we've got the window in England would have just opened by the time this episode goes out a few days ago. The Italian, French, and German windows in a month's time, the US in 2 months' time on the 1st of August, and then there are others already open, including Racheal's home nation in Zambia. And for those who don't know, not only do the national transfer windows on the FIFA calendar not align, but the windows for men's and women's football don't align either in some countries. So, with transfers in mind, do you think the record will be broken again in this fast approaching summer window? And also, how do you see the value of transfers in women's football developing, not just in this next window, but also in the next year and beyond?
I think it's highly probable that that figure is eclipsed this summer. And certainly, if not this summer, it will be within the next 12 or 18 months, that's for sure. And I think that will be a continuous process over the next couple of years, that a record that had actually stood for quite a long time is just going to keep getting eclipsed as the sport grows. But I think you might see one or two deals that really shock people in terms of their value, like going past into the millions. But in general, over the next couple of years, I think the growth will just be the growth of transfers involving a fee right across the board. So I think you'll see a lot more deals that are, at the kind of 2, 3, 4, 500,000 range, which just weren't there 4 or 5 years ago. So I think that's the big development, that players are signing longer contracts, and therefore fees are beginning to be expected on a large percentage of transfers at the higher levels of the game. And I think that's only going to be to the benefit of the industry, in terms of clubs know that if they recruit well, if they develop players, that they'll be rewarded for that when they weren't previously being rewarded. And obviously it makes our job a little more complicated in a way, but at the same time, you also don't want all your clients coming to the end of their contract every year because they're being offered 1-year deals. So I think it's definitely to the benefit of the clients and the agents that 3, 4-year deals are much more common now.
In terms of agents and women's football, how have you seen that change in recent times, whether good or bad? Is there anything that particularly sticks out for you?
I think, going back 5, 6 years, there weren't that many agents in the women's game. Everyone kind of knew everyone else. And that's got more the way of men's football now, where there's new names and new agencies cropping up all the time. There's also, big agencies from the men's side getting involved, or from other sports even getting involved. And that's something that will only continue as those fees and salaries continue to increase. So I think, yeah, it's become a lot wider in its scope, and that brings with it the same challenges that you guys are all familiar with from the men's side, in terms of just exactly who are some of the people getting involved. And also, you do in certain markets see very little attention paid to whether people are licensed or registered, or things like that. So it's heading very much in the same direction that I experienced in men's football 10 years back.
Now, one question we try to ask all our agent-related guests on the podcast is, if you were to describe the football agents world in one word, what would it be and why? And you might want to differentiate whether it's a word to describe women's football or men's football from the agency side. There's one person conned two answers out of that from me. You're only getting one, I'm afraid, Chris.
I would use the word misunderstood, because I don't think the general public fully understand the job that agents do. And that's, I think, often a deliberate ploy that we allow in some cases, that we take the blame on behalf of clients. But also, it's very easy for the clubs and the media to lay the blame at agents as a kind of malign influence on the game. But I think if you really came to it, there aren't many clubs who would like to do the job without agents involved. It gets far more complicated at that point. And if you ask 95% of players, I would say they would have the same opinion. And that's ultimately why they all have agents. Their lives would be much more complicated without agents' presence. So, yeah, I misunderstood.
It is reported that player salaries in women's football in the USA are generally lower than those in the top women's leagues in Europe at the moment. Although teams like Angel City from Los Angeles, as well as actually the National Women's Soccer League broadcast deal, may change this in the future. But the commercial opportunities in the US potentially balance that disparity in wages between the US and Europe. Is that correct? And what challenges does that present to the agent when weighing up an offer between, say, an American National Women's Soccer League club and a top team from Europe?
I would say it was correct prior to the most recent broadcast deal in NWSL, which has seen the 14 teams there share, I believe, $60 million a year. So that has changed things. That's how you're seeing Racheal's transfer. You've seen Barbara Banda and other significant deals happen. And obviously those involve significant wages as well that weren't necessarily being offered in Europe. Now, are the top few paid players still in Europe? Absolutely. From my knowledge, that's the case. Because obviously NWSL is still slightly impinged by the salary cap structure that they have. But the understanding is that the salary cap is going to continue to rise. A lot of contracts being offered at the moment are being designed with that in mind, with staggered salaries in the US. So therefore, I think on a purely salary level, NWSL is increasingly an attractive option. Now, are they better commercially than most European sides? Yeah, it's a different ballgame. The US women's market in terms of commercial opportunities is at a level that I've not seen elsewhere. I'll give you an example. We had, I think, 10 players drafted in the NWSL draft as an agency this year, and all of them have had some form of commercial opportunity since that draft in January. And, you're talking players in their first year as professionals, and that kind of opportunity certainly doesn't exist in Europe.
That's very interesting, Chris, because we know with college sports in America, there has been that move to name, image, likeness, where top college athletes in all sports have an ability now to earn money from their likeness or their brand. And that's obviously something that's quite prevalent in the US. Just generally in the US sports, We feel, looking from the outside, it's generally more mature when it comes to the attitude and treatment towards sports agents or football agents when you compare it to the likes of football agents in Europe. Do you think that is an accurate perception? And what are the main ways you perceive it's different as a European agent operating in the US and the challenges you face?
I personally have found it very straightforward. So my first deal in NWSL would have been 3 years ago now. And what I like about it is obviously the contracts and structure in terms of agent fees as well are all the same in every team. They're paid by the league. I don't know if that's the same on the men's side, but the agent fees are paid by the NWSL and there's no real negotiation needed on that. It's a predetermined percentage. So it's a very straightforward process from the commission agent fees side of things. They always pay on time, which is something else that I'm sure you guys realize is well received. But yeah, it's in that sense, it's been straightforward. I would say the challenge is, I believe from the men's side, talking to some agents, there is sometimes an issue over taxation of agent fees in the US. It's not been an issue that I've encountered on the women's side yet, but I know it does exist on the men's, that the amount received is less than people were expecting. The other thing is, I think, just understanding the complexities of the US tax system in terms of advising clients as well. And early on, it's important to get someone who knows what they're talking about to advise on that front, because the tax bill can be complicated. And obviously, nobody has clients who want to be suddenly paying out a lot more than they expected.
With the transfer of Racheal to Bay FC, which I believe is based in the San Francisco greater region, this still was looked at in terms of there's different nationalities, cultures, and leagues. You had a European, obviously agents, North American club, African player. In terms of those dynamics, what are the biggest differences you note as an agent in cultures and nationalities, whether it be clubs, players, leagues, on agent-related matters? And if you were going to give any simple advice to agents handling these dynamics when all these differences, culturally especially, are at play in a deal?
I mean, it's a great question. I think when it comes to the player, it's important to know obviously what motivates your client. What's the motivation before any new opportunity or contract? If you have that knowledge, you can obviously search out an opportunity that satisfies the client, first of all. And those motivations, I think, are heavily influenced by background. So myself, I do have a large client base in terms of players from Africa. They're often supporting wider families, and therefore that financial side of things can be higher on their priorities than it might be for some of my other clients. Now, that's not universally true, but in a general understanding of it, that's often the case. When it comes to the clubs from different countries, I mean, you guys will, I'm sure, have seen it yourself. You deal with people from different cultures in very different ways if you want to get the right end result. Like, I think the one that stands out for me, having done business in China, is that that's done in a very different way than it is internationally, in terms of it involves discussions taking place over meals out, often over a few drinks as well. And it's a far more informal way of dealing with it than when you're in an office in a club in West London or whatever. And it's a far more structured, we're here to talk about this and this only. Whereas, say, on the Chinese side of things, you might have 2 hours of general conversation before you actually get to the point. So it's about understanding where you are, understanding how business is done in that culture. And I don't necessarily think that you need to football agency, but it is a industry that involves a lot of global connections.
Now, as with a lot of agents who specialize in women's football, you've also, as you mentioned, represented players from the men's game as well as the women's. What are the main differences you note as an agent, if any?
I would say the differences are fewer and fewer. The women's game is headed in a direction that is increasingly similar to the men's game. Okay, the sums at the top level are not what they are in the men's game, but the salaries in women's football would be, in a lot of cases, they would be good salaries for many men's players now. So I think the expectations on agents are becoming very similar. I don't think it's as cutthroat at this moment. And I don't think it's as ruthless, but that aspect is definitely coming. as the money increases, I think the ruthlessness and the lack of loyalty that sometimes people complain about in the men's game, it will come in. But for the moment, I think that there's not too many differences, to be honest.
I think that was reflected in our conversations with Maria a few episodes back. Well, quite a few episodes back now, that there's not that cutthroat nature as it stands, but there are signs that things in the dynamics in that sense might be starting to change. Is it actually safe to ask you which you prefer working with, which clients?
Yeah.
Do you prefer working with players in the men's game to the women's, or maybe more appropriate to ask you what are the positive and more challenging elements that each bring to you as an agent?
I think I got into women's football before it escalated at a time where you could really build personal relationships because people were often in their position at clubs for a long time. So that was an aspect of it that I enjoyed in terms of you saw the same faces in their position for extended periods of time. That's changing as it is in the men's game. That coaches and sports directors' jobs are very perilous, and it's definitely heading that way on the women's side of things. But I enjoyed that aspect of it, that you could really build a strong relationship that would obviously be to the benefit of your clients. I think in terms of working with the players, I wouldn't say I have any preference, but I enjoy the challenges that women's football faces in terms of trying to improve those levels and standards on behalf of the client. I think to be involved in the sport at the moment where it's growing so rapidly is very enjoyable in itself.
Chris, we've seen that the women's game is evolving rapidly. National teams like my own, the Australian women's team, the Matildas, is a national icon here and really a huge commercial success and performance success as well. Club leagues like in Mexico really expanding and growing it all the time with exciting football. We've seen national teams like South Africa or Colombia developing huge talent. We saw that in last Women's World Cup here in Australia and New Zealand. And with that, it's pleasing to see also FIFA, or probably more appropriately FIFPro, the players who are driving it. And we've seen research by the likes of Dr. Alex Colvin. She did some research on women's football, ensuring that appropriate rights, regulations, safeguards are in place for female players, including, for instance, some changes in terms of maternity leave. Both for yourself as an agent and for your player clients, what are the most welcoming aspects that you've seen introduced recently? And what else would you like to see introduced in women's football sooner rather than later?
I think the big change in recent years has been what you mentioned in terms of FIFA putting in place regulation with regard to maternity leave, and the clubs also having to put in place structures with regards to return to play following that process. And I think you haven't seen widespread uptake of those possibilities yet, but I think at the top level, you've seen a number of players go off, have children, and then return to play, which a few years back wasn't the case that you were seeing the number that you have now. So there's started to be uptake. I think it's still very much at the higher levels where clubs are helping with that return to play process, but they're increasingly more widespread examples of that. I think the big challenge in the next few years, and probably this is very similar on the men's side as well, is just going to be players loading in terms of minutes, travel, all the extra competitions that are being added. I mean, you have scenarios now where some of the girls could be playing 60, 70 games a year, and all the international travel that involves. And I think especially when you're seeing the number of ACL injuries that happen in the women's game in particular, that strain on the body has to be accounted for. And I think in terms of FIFPro, that's something I would like to see them make a real stand in the next few years is, okay, all these competitions are great. Everyone enjoys the benefits of the money coming into the game, but how do we regulate it that the players are not pushed past breaking point, basically?
Yes, I've seen that there's a lot of research going into disproportionate amount of ACLs, knee injuries in women's football, especially at the professional level. So it'd be good to get some research done in order to see if there's, just say, loading or other factors which can stop knee injuries occurring so often. Just to close, if you had one wish, Chris, for the future of football agency or the football agent industry, what would it be?
I actually hope that the current impasse in terms of the FIFA regulation can actually be resolved in a manner that satisfies everyone, because I think the industry does need form of oversight. I think everyone that I speak to would welcome some form of regulation, but also some authority to make sure that agents are actually paid what they're due as well by clubs. But at the same time, that doesn't impinge on the kind of free market aspect of the industry. And I think if both sides can kind of find a compromise on that, it would be to the benefit of the whole footballing industry, from players to clubs to agents as well. So I hope in the near future that that whole situation is resolved. And I'm sure it's something you guys have discussed over and over on this show.
We have, and we're all for compromises or collaboration between stakeholders, including FIFA, the agents, the national associations, clubs, etc. So yes, we all would like certainty, because you want a certainty in the regulations and the landscape you work with. But thank you, Chris. We really appreciate you coming on, giving us some fantastic insights, and also something to think about in terms of the nuanced or unique world of women's football, especially the excitement in that space. Because I just think of Angel City and recently their launches and what was going on. Obviously, you've got, if I can call them celebrities or stars backing, but we're seeing a lot of these celebrities and stars, especially from the US, backing teams as investors in branding, etc. So really exciting times for women's football, and very well deserved. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much for having me.
Very impressive interview from Chris on how the women's side of the football agency is developing and evolving. And also, it's good to see that agents are finding their niche, because I think you either got to be big, like a big agency, or niche. And through hard work, you get your deals done.
From talking to Chris, I think he actually downplays it a bit, and the experience he has and what he's achieved and what he continues to achieve. A lot of agents would shout about it, have a huge amount of bravado, ego, and swagger, but that simply wasn't the case with Chris, and that was nice to hear. But I think it's safe to say he shares similar views, opinions, and concerns to ourselves and many others in the agents world, whether it be the uncertainties and inconsistencies over FFAR, or the less savoury factors and practices prevalent in the men's game that are starting to emerge in the women's game from an agent's perspective.
Yes, obviously, we know in terms of the men's game, the agency, there's a certain way of doing things, and we know how it sort of works, but there are certain things we don't want to see. The women's game has been growing, and hopefully that there are no bad habits emerging on that side of the business. But even the men's game, we need to eradicate those. It's about ethics, integrity, professionalism, being trained, and all these messages and objectives need to be implemented by all agents, and really something that we ought to got to reflect on, that we need this industry as transparent and dynamic as possible to serve all our clients and build football overall. Now, time for that notice board that we call quick takes. We've got 4 or 5 today, but it's always interesting to get snippets of what's happening around the agents world. And I'll start with this first quick take. I've got to start with the title, Jonathan. Lotito Tough Negotiator. Renowned football agent Enzo Raiola names Lazio as one of the clubs they're looking to sign Feyenoord Rotterdam playmaker Calvin Stengs this summer. Now, in the interview with Calcio Mercato, and this is the important part of this quick take, the agent insists that finding an agreement with club president Claudio Lotito is never easy. He mentions that there are some clubs with which it's more difficult to close a deal. Lazio is one of these. Lotito, the president of Lazio, is a tough negotiator, a person whom it's difficult to find an agreement with. Very interesting to pretty much go out in public and mention the fact that Lotito is a very, very tough negotiator for even someone of Raiola. This is Enzo Raiola's statue.
Tough negotiators in football, hey, Peter? I think we all know a few of those over the years, whether they be chief execs, club owners, agents, or even the partners and parents of players. And personally, I don't mind tough negotiators as long as they are sensible, reasonable, and respectful. And on the topic of tough negotiators, I remember one quote from an agent about Daniel Levy, the chairman of Tottenham Hotspur, who's quite renowned for being pretty tough on transfer dealings. And I believe the quote was along the lines of, "He enjoys the argument in negotiating. I swear if I went back with a request for lower wages than what he was offering, he would still have argued."
I actually saw another quote from Daniel Levy, and if I can just cheekily put it in here, A good negotiation is when all involved parties are not happy at the end. So maybe not as good as quote as yours, but it makes sense. Daniel Levy, a tough negotiator, knows when to leave the table. I'll move on to quick take number 2. And this is an interesting one, and agents need to know about this. This is very important. It's articles that relate to FIFA bans clubs, and in particular 16 Saudi clubs from registering new players. And before I go into this quick take, agents need to be aware, and FIFA publishes this, which clubs can't register players during transfer windows. Because if you know you can't send your players there, you need to reassess where can you send them. And the newspaper reported that there are 16 Saudi clubs that have been banned from registering new players by decision of FIFA after losing their cases with players and coaches, I assume due to undue payables. The clubs that were subjected to penalty included various first and second division clubs, but mainly second division I can see here. The lawsuits were against these clubs, and in order to lift these restrictions, they need to pay out what's owing to players, etc. But it doesn't end there. There's another article where FIFA's listed transfer ban clubs include top-tier teams, not just in Saudi, but also in Africa and Argentina. And this one comes from apnews.com. And it mentions top African teams and 5 in Argentina. These clubs include San Lorenzo, Wydad of Morocco, and TP Mazembe, a powerhouse from Congo. All have won continental championships and played at the FIFA World Cup. And just to finish on this quick take from my point of view, FIFA can impose bans typically for 2 or 3 windows after clubs break transfer regulations or have unpaid transfer debts to other clubs. And this is very important to know for agents who is unable to register players with the National Federation.
I think it's important also to scrutinise these articles because some of them say bans from registrations and some of them say transfer bans. And there's a bit of a difference between those two sets of terminology, and terminology is important. One article was 76 African clubs banned from transfers by FIFA. So I'm going to be a bit cynical on this one, and there's no surprise there, I hear you say, as I'm pretty cynical on a lot of matters related to the football industry nowadays. But this ban on Saudi Arabia clubs, I think, can be made to go away quite quickly. Dare I say, with some of the friendships between certain elements at FIFA and the Saudi football authorities. Plus, we have to consider the 2034 World Cup. So I think those clubs will see bans lifted in the not too distant future should the Saudi authorities decide to step in and want it to happen. But sadly, the African clubs, I think, may well be being used as an example to others. But I hope that isn't the case and they are allowed to sell players, as many of those clubs rely on that revenue. Plus, I don't think it's really fair to restrict a player or an agent for what a club has possibly done or not done, and what may be a one and only opportunity to launch a player's football career and change their lives.
Yeah, before I go to the next quick take, if you recall, Jonathan, Barcelona, Real Madrid, Atletico Madrid also FIFA registration bans because of signing youth players in international deals. I think those bans were frozen, so we don't know the full picture. Some of these bans could be appealed and be frozen, but it's been happening for a long time, even the big clubs like the 3 Spanish I mentioned. So we'll move on to the next quick take, and the article here is foremost football agent celebrates real estate agent in grand style. This article came out from Nigeria, from BSN Sports. And Makanjuola Nureni, one of the football agents in Africa, celebrated his 70th birthday by having a special football game with a real estate surveyor manager. The key thing about this is this agent's been around a long time and he's really pushed a lot of Nigerian players into bigger markets and organised this event not to celebrate his career in football, but also to develop relations with the real estate community. It's about jobs. So this is really about an agent looking at his legacy and engaging with other industries to develop jobs for locals. This agent, Mr. Nureni, active in that space, and that's an interesting article, and good to see some positive articles like this showing a lot of agents who we don't see involved in their communities and assisting different stakeholders. Now I'll move on to another interesting quick take. Le football il a change. It's from LinkedIn. It's an article on Mbappe. And it relates to his sentence, Le football il a change. My French is not that good. It's a famous quote, and it's a registered trademark. And Mbappe owns 7 trademarks in the EU, including his goal celebration pose, one that I think he crosses his hands, his name, the logo of his company. He's now joining Cristiano Ronaldo, Messi, and I believe Vinicius Jr. as the world's most IP-protected football players. But besides the name, because obviously the name is easily recognizable, it's very interesting to see a celebration or a pose being registered. Kylian Mbappe, one of the world's top footballers, now a master of trademark protection.
I think we saw previously Gareth Bale or Stella might have tried to trademark the heart-shaped goal celebration that he used to do, but the topics of IP, image rights, management companies, name, image, likeness, and trademark protection is just going to grow and become more complex, not necessarily just for the top players and their agents, but also arguably those lower down the football hierarchy. And Mbappe is seemingly taking it to a whole new level, which Jean-Baptiste touched upon in episode 35 of the Agents Angle, in him being more than just a footballer. And there was one final quick take that at the time of recording isn't yet concluded, not least because the relevant transfer windows and registration periods aren't all active just yet. It is a transfer story, but it does relate to something we covered extensively in the last episode of the Agents Angle.
And that story is Michael Olise chooses to join Bayern Munich from Crystal Palace. It's actually in the New York Times or The Athletic. David Ornstein with Matt Slater, one of the big writers in football. He mentions Michael Olise, the 22-year-old France youth international, is putting speculation to end this summer. And I think we also mentioned earlier in this episode that Bayern and maybe some other German teams are very interested in talent coming out of England. In this case, a Frenchman, but coming out of England. And they're one of the few teams that can afford this type of player. There was speculation that Newcastle United were also interested, plus the big Manchester clubs. But it looks like the German club could beat them all for Olise.
Yeah, just a few quick observations and things I'm curious about with this story, Peter, leading on from what we discussed previously. Firstly, there's no surprise of a move in this window with the imminent suspension of the player's agent later this year in England. Secondly, a move to Germany is interesting with no FFAR or agent regulations technically in Germany at the moment. And the link to Germany is still in place with regards to a FIFA perspective on agent matters. So what role did it being a transfer to a German club have to play in this reported transfer? Not least the ability of the agent to arguably still represent the player in Germany and undertake his agent duties to the client in that territory, even if they were to be suspended in England. And finally, there are reports in this of a sell-on fee of 10% going to Reading, who were the club sanctioned for breaches of the late RWWI, Regulations on Working with Intermediaries, which related primarily to the proposition of 10% of the transfer fee going to the agent. But on that matter, we will possibly have to wait until March or April in 2025 to see which agents are declared to have acted in this latest transaction. That is, if the FA in England still produce the annual declarations regarding agents in 2025 and beyond, and or where the FIFA will be allowed to publish such information following an ECJ ruling on FFAR, if that has been concluded by that time.
Interesting times ahead. I know that part of FIFA's FFAR was to get more information about agents and deals, a bit like the FA, as you say, Jonathan. And that's interesting for research. And also, when we make comments on articles, we know the exact facts. And that's important, but we're very careful in trying to be transparent, concise, and cross our T's, as we say here in Australia, to make sure what we're saying is a reflection of what's happening out there. But there's going to be some big stories, some big signings. And as we mentioned earlier in the episode, we mentioned 11 trends. Let's see if some of those reflections and trends do come true in the market. So interesting times ahead. And you mentioned also the ECJ decision. A couple of big decisions, Diarra I mentioned earlier. And then, of course, hopefully we get some clarity of when the FIFA Football Agent Regulations decision by the European Court of Justice will come. I think by the end of the year, we'll have definitely some update of where that is heading, Jonathan.
And that brings us to the end of this episode of The Agent's Angle. As always, send in your comments, questions and queries either via social media channels or email us on questions@theagentsangle.com. With just 2 episodes to go for this season, And all being well, in the next few episodes, we have something a bit special for you in terms of a guest interview. An insight we have strived to obtain for several months now, but until now have failed in getting such valuable contributions on the show.
Yes, please keep your questions coming. Please review us on Spotify, give us some ratings. We're really interested in getting your feedback. And as Jonathan mentioned, next episode, someone who is going to bring a whole different insight to the agent's business. And I won't say more than that. So good luck for the window. Enjoy the Euros. Enjoy the Copa America. So much to look forward to. And yeah, let's hope for an exciting transfer window with some big deals. And bye from me.
So until the next episode of The Agent's Angle, please do take care and bye for now.
The purpose of the Agent's Angle podcast is to provide news, information and facilitate discussion on regulatory matters, policies, business trends and issues affecting football agents worldwide. The opinions and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only and should never be considered legal or professional advice. Furthermore, the views expressed by guests are their own and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Thank you for listening.